There is a distinction that most people never think to make, and it is the one that explains almost everything about why empaths find themselves exhausted, confused, and quietly trapped in relationships they didn't choose to be trapped in. Most conversations about empaths focus on how much they give. They give attention, understanding, emotional presence, and time. And the common assumption is that this giving attracts people who take. But that framing is incomplete, because there is a significant difference between someone who takes and someone who seeks to own. Taking is transactional. It happens, it ends, and it moves on. Ownership is something else entirely. Ownership is the need to possess the source, not just to receive what someone offers, but to ensure that what they offer belongs to you, is accessible only through you, and cannot be withdrawn. And that distinction, the difference between someone who wants connection and someone who wants control over connection, is where the real psychology of this dynamic begins. To understand why empaths specifically attract this kind of person, you have to first understand what an empath actually offers that is so rare it becomes dangerous. It is not just kindness. Kindness is common enough. It is not just generosity, because generosity can be found in many people. What empaths offer, at a level most people have never experienced before, is unconditional emotional comprehension. They make you feel understood without having to explain yourself perfectly. They track the emotion beneath your words, not just the words. They sense what you are not saying as clearly as what you are. And for most people, that experience is not familiar. For many, it is the first time they have ever felt genuinely perceived. That feeling is profound. And like anything profound that someone has never had access to before, it does not simply feel good. It feels necessary. That is the first shift. The moment something goes from feeling good to feeling necessary is the moment dependency begins forming. And dependency, when it is never examined, when it is never brought to the surface and understood for what it is, does not stay neutral. It mutates. It becomes possessive. It begins to generate fear, the fear of losing access to the one thing that made the person feel whole for the first time. And that fear does not produce gratitude. It produces the quiet, unconscious drive to secure the source. This is not something most people are aware they are doing. That is important to understand. The person who begins to develop a possessive orientation toward an empath rarely frames it to themselves as possession. They frame it as love. They frame it as closeness, as devotion, as the natural intensity of caring about someone deeply. And because the empath is wired to feel beneath the surface of behavior, they often sense the intensity and interpret it through a compassionate lens. It feels like depth. It feels like someone who cares more than most people do. And in the beginning, it can be difficult to see what is actually forming beneath that intensity, because the feelings being expressed are real, even if the structure beneath them is unstable. The problem is not that the feeling is false. The problem is what the feeling requires in order to survive. Because love, in its healthiest form, does not require control to feel secure. Love that is psychologically grounded can tolerate space, can tolerate independence, can tolerate the other person existing fully outside the relationship without experiencing that as a threat. Possessiveness cannot. Possessiveness needs proximity. It needs exclusivity. It needs the reassurance of access. And it will, often without conscious intention, begin to quietly restructure the relationship in ways that guarantee that access is never threatened. This is where empaths find themselves at a unique disadvantage, because the same depth of awareness that allows them to feel what is happening in others also creates a responsibility they feel toward what they feel. An empath doesn't just notice someone's pain at a surface level and move on. They absorb it. They process it. And once they have felt the depth of another person's need, they carry a sense of obligation toward it that most people simply do not have. This is not weakness. This is the specific architecture of how empathic wiring operates. But it creates a vulnerability that possessive people, again often without full awareness, locate and settle into. Because when your need is met by someone who feels responsible for your pain, you have found something very specific. You have found someone whose own emotional wiring makes them unlikely to leave. You have found someone who will interpret your escalating need as a signal to give more, not as a signal to step back. You have found, in the most psychological sense of the word, someone you can anchor to. And anchoring is the beginning of ownership. What makes this dynamic so difficult to identify early is that it does not announce itself. There is no moment where the possessive person declares their intention. There is no visible shift in the relationship that the empath can point to and say, that is where things changed. Instead, it arrives gradually. It arrives in the way the other person begins to need more of the empath's time, and the way the empath begins to reorganize their own life to provide it. It arrives in the way the other person responds when the empath is unavailable, and the quiet guilt that begins to build in the empath as a result. It arrives in the increasing sense that the empath's emotional energy is no longer something they choose to give freely, but something that has already been claimed. And by the time that shift becomes visible, the structure of the relationship has already changed around the empath without them fully registering when it happened. Because ownership does not break in. It moves in quietly, one small accommodation at a time, until the empath looks around and realizes that somewhere along the way, the relationship stopped being a choice and started being an obligation. And the deepest, most unsettling part of all of this is not the control itself. It is that the empath often cannot identify the moment they consented to it, because they never did. What they consented to was connection. What they were given, slowly and without announcement, was a cage built entirely from their own compassion. Not everyone who tries to own an empath looks the same. That is one of the reasons the pattern is so difficult to recognize until it has already taken hold. Most people carry a fixed image of what a controlling person looks like. They imagine someone loud, domineering, obviously aggressive in their demands. But the people who seek to own empaths rarely fit that image. They don't need to be loud. They don't need force. Because they have found something far more effective than force. They have found someone whose own emotional depth makes them extraordinarily easy to hold without chains. The possession happens quietly, and it happens through 4 distinct psychological profiles, each one different in its method, but identical in its destination. Understanding these profiles is not about labeling people or reducing complex human beings to categories. It is about giving the empath something they are almost never given early enough. A pattern to recognize before the damage is done. The first profile is what could be called the emotional dependent. This is the person who has never developed a stable internal relationship with their own emotional world. They have not learned how to sit with discomfort without help. They have not built the capacity to self-regulate, to process their own pain privately, to find equilibrium without external support. And when they encounter an empath, they encounter something that functions for them the way a missing internal structure would. The empath becomes the regulator. The empath becomes the place where their emotions go to be sorted, understood, and returned to them in a form they can manage. At first, this can feel like intimacy. It can feel like being trusted with someone's most vulnerable interior. But what becomes clear over time is that the dependency never decreases. Every crisis is followed by another crisis. Every moment of stabilization is temporary, because the stability was never being built inside the person. It was being borrowed from the empath. And borrowed stability has to be repaid constantly. The emotional dependent does not try to own the empath through aggression. They own them through perpetual need. The empath cannot leave, because leaving feels like abandoning someone who will genuinely fall apart without them. And that feeling, however real it seems, is the cage. The second profile is the identity borrower. This person is more subtle and, in many ways, more psychologically complex. They do not come to the empath broken in an obvious way. They come curious, drawn in, increasingly close. But what is happening beneath the surface is a process of absorption. Through proximity to the empath, they begin to take on the empath's qualities as their own self-definition. The empath's depth becomes part of their identity. The empath's warmth becomes something they point to as evidence of who they are. The relationship itself becomes central to how they understand themselves. And this creates a specific kind of possessiveness, because when the empath begins to grow, to change, to create distance, it does not feel to this person like a relationship shifting. It feels like identity theft. They do not experience the empath's independence as a boundary. They experience it as a loss of self, and they respond accordingly, with a clinging that is framed not as control, but as need, not as possession, but as love so deep it cannot function without the other person present. The third profile is the covert competitor. This one is perhaps the most counterintuitive, because this person often presents as someone who admires the empath deeply. They speak about the empath's awareness with genuine appreciation. They seek out the empath's perception and openly value it. But beneath that appreciation is something unresolved. The empath's ability to see clearly, to perceive what others miss, to exist in a level of awareness that feels elevated, creates a quiet threat in someone who has built their identity around being the most perceptive person in the room. They cannot dismiss the empath. They cannot compete with the empath openly. So instead, they seek to own them. Because if you control the person whose perception threatens you, you neutralize the threat. If the empath's clarity belongs to you, if it is directed toward you and through you, it is no longer something that exposes you. It becomes something that serves you. This profile is dangerous precisely because it masquerades as deep appreciation. The empath feels seen and valued. What they do not yet feel is that the appreciation itself is a form of control. The fourth profile is the possessive protector. And this is the most dangerous of all, because it is the most convincing. This person does not look like someone trying to own anyone. They look like someone who loves deeply, who cares intensely, who wants nothing more than to keep the empath safe. They use the language of devotion. They frame their presence as protection. They position the empath's world as something threatening and themselves as the one constant source of safety within it. And because empaths often carry a quiet history of feeling too much in environments that did not understand them, the offer of unconditional safety is not just appealing. It is disarming. The possessive protector understands, again often without conscious awareness, that the fastest way to own someone who has been emotionally exhausted by the world is to become their shelter from it. And shelters, by their nature, have walls. The empath moves in seeking rest and discovers, gradually and then all at once, that the door has quietly been closed behind them. None of these four people believe they are trying to own anyone. That is the most important thing to hold on to as you move through this. The possession is real. The damage is real. But the intention is almost never visible, not even to the person acting on it. And that is exactly what makes these patterns so hard to name, so easy to excuse, and so necessary to understand before they become the entire architecture of a relationship that was never designed to let you leave. There is a question that empaths almost always ask themselves at some point in the middle of these dynamics, and it is not the question you might expect. It is not why is this person doing this to me? It is why didn't I see it sooner? Because by the time the pattern becomes visible, by the time the weight of it has become undeniable, the empath is usually already deep inside a structure that took months or years to build around them. And the confusion is genuine, because empaths are perceptive. They notice things others miss. They read emotional undercurrents with a precision that most people do not possess. So how does someone with that level of awareness end up inside a dynamic they didn't see forming? The answer is not that their perception failed them. The answer is that their perception was turned against them. And understanding how that happens is perhaps the most important psychological insight an empath can carry. The first reason empaths miss the pattern is that they are wired to look beneath behavior rather than at it. This is one of the defining qualities of empathic perception. Where most people respond to what someone does, empaths respond to why they sense someone is doing it. They see the wound beneath the action. They feel the fear beneath the demand. They sense the pain beneath the control. And this capacity, which in many contexts is a profound gift, becomes a liability in this specific dynamic. Because when someone is behaving in a possessive way, the empath does not primarily register the possession. They register the vulnerability driving it. They feel how frightened this person is of losing them. They feel how much this person needs them. And need, when felt deeply by someone who is wired to respond to emotional pain, does not trigger alarm. It triggers compassion. It triggers the instinct to move closer, not further away. So the very mechanism that would protect most people, the discomfort of feeling controlled, the instinct to create distance when someone becomes too demanding, is in the empath redirected inward as a responsibility to help rather than outward as a boundary to enforce. The second reason is more specific, and it has to do with how possessive people unconsciously learn to use the empath's empathy as a regulatory tool. This happens through a process that is rarely deliberate, but is devastatingly effective. The possessive person learns, through experience in a relationship, that when they express distress, the empath responds. When they create a crisis, the empath engages. When they signal pain, the empath moves toward them. And so distress becomes, without either person fully naming it, a mechanism of access. Not because the person is calculating or consciously manipulative in most cases, but because they have found that this is what keeps the empath present, invested, and emotionally close. The empath, for their part, experiences this as being needed. And being needed, for someone whose sense of purpose is deeply tied to their capacity to help, feels meaningful. It feels like the relationship has depth. What it actually has is a structure that ensures the empath's attention can always be recaptured through the production of emotional need. And the more the empath responds to that need, the more the pattern is reinforced, until it becomes the invisible architecture of how the relationship functions. The third reason empaths miss the pattern early is one of the most psychologically precise of all. They confuse the intensity of someone's feeling for the quality of it. Possessiveness is, at its core, an intense emotion. The fear of losing someone, the need to secure their presence, the anxiety that rises when access is threatened, these are not mild experiences. They produce a level of emotional intensity that can feel, from the outside, like profound love. Like someone who cares so deeply they cannot imagine life without you. And for an empath who has spent much of their life around people who were emotionally unavailable, who offered little, who were present in body but absent in feeling, the sudden encounter with someone whose emotional intensity is overwhelming can feel like finally being truly loved. The intensity reads as depth. The need reads as devotion. The possessiveness reads as passion. And by the time the empath begins to feel the difference between someone loving them and someone needing to own them, the two feelings have become so fused in the relationship that separating them feels like dismantling something real. The fourth reason is perhaps the quietest, and it is the one that keeps empaths inside these dynamics long after they have begun to sense something is wrong. It is the guilt mechanism. And this is where possessive people, even without strategic intent, locate the most powerful lever available to them. Because empaths feel guilt acutely. Not ordinary guilt, but a specific kind of guilt that is tied to their awareness. When an empath considers pulling back, when they begin to create distance or assert a boundary, they do not just feel the discomfort of the other person's reaction. They feel the other person's pain as if it were their own. They feel the fear, the abandonment, the destabilization that their withdrawal produces in someone who has built their entire emotional structure around the empath's presence. And that feeling, the felt experience of causing someone else's pain, is almost intolerable for someone who is wired toward empathy. So they stay. They soften the boundary they were about to draw. They return to a level of availability they had just begun to question. And the possessive person, whether consciously or not, learns that pain is the price of reentry, that expressing how much the empath's distance hurts will bring the empath back. And the cycle deepens. The very thing that makes empaths extraordinary, their capacity to feel what others feel, becomes the mechanism that holds them in place inside dynamics they already sense are not right. That is not a failure of perception. That is perception being used against itself. And recognizing that distinction, understanding that the problem was never that you didn't feel enough, but that you felt too much in the direction of someone else's need and not enough in the direction of your own, is the beginning of something the possessive dynamic almost never allows. It is the beginning of seeing clearly. Most people imagine control in relationships as something visible, something loud. They picture ultimatums delivered in raised voices, explicit demands, obvious surveillance. And because that image is so fixed in the cultural imagination, empaths often spend a long time inside dynamics that are quietly suffocating them, without being able to name what is happening, because nothing they are experiencing matches the image they have been taught to look for. The control they are living inside does not look like control. It looks like love. It looks like closeness. It looks like someone who simply cares more than anyone else ever has. And that is precisely why it works. Because ownership in emotional relationships does not arrive with a declaration. It arrives through a series of behavioral patterns, each one small enough to seem reasonable in isolation, each one easy enough to excuse or explain away on its own, but collectively forming something that only becomes visible when you step far enough back to see the whole structure at once. These are the patterns, not as a checklist, but as a map. Because the empath who can recognize the territory is the one who has a chance of choosing their direction before the path closes behind them. The first pattern is emotional monopolizing. This is the slow, quiet process by which the possessive person positions themselves as the only legitimate space where the empath processes their inner life. It does not happen through prohibition. The possessive person rarely says directly that the empath should not talk to others, should not seek understanding elsewhere, should not have relationships that offer what this one offers. Instead, it happens through something more subtle. It happens through the way the possessive person responds when the empath does seek connection elsewhere. A slight withdrawal, a coolness that was not there before, a comment delivered lightly but carrying weight, something that communicates, without stating it directly, that closeness with others is a kind of disloyalty. And the empath, who is acutely sensitive to shifts in emotional atmosphere, registers this. They begin to self-censor. They begin to edit what they share with others. They begin to bring more and more of their interior world exclusively to this one person. Not because they were told to, but because the emotional cost of doing otherwise slowly became too high to pay repeatedly. And over time, the empath's relational world narrows, not through force, but through the accumulated weight of subtle emotional consequence. The second pattern is manufactured dependency. This one operates differently. Rather than narrowing the empath's world outward, it narrows the empath's perception of their own capacity inward. The possessive person, again often without fully conscious intent, creates a steady stream of situations in which the empath's help is needed. Their judgment is required. Their presence is essential. There is always a crisis forming. There is always a decision that cannot be made without the empath's input. There is always an emotional emergency that arrives precisely at the moments when the empath was beginning to invest energy elsewhere. And the message embedded in this pattern, never stated but consistently communicated, is this: you are needed here. You cannot step away from this. What would happen if you did? The empath, whose sense of purpose is deeply tied to being useful, to making a difference in the lives of people they care about, does not experience this as manipulation. They experience it as being important to someone. But importance that is manufactured through constant crisis is not the same as being genuinely valued. It is being strategically necessary. And necessary is another word for trapped. The third pattern is the punishment of independence. This is where the dynamic reveals something closer to its true nature, though still through language that can always be explained away. When the empath invests energy somewhere else, when they spend time with friends the possessive person did not sanction, when they pursue something that generates a sense of self that exists outside the relationship, the possessive person responds in a specific way. Not with anger necessarily, though sometimes that too. More often with a particular emotional withdrawal that the empath has learned to feel as their fault. A silence that is slightly too long. An absence of the warmth that is usually present. A distance that communicates, without a single direct word, that something has been done wrong. And because the empath is wired to feel responsible for the emotional atmosphere around them, they do not experience this as the other person's reaction to their independence. They experience it as evidence that their independence causes harm. And the next time they consider investing in something outside the relationship, they remember that feeling. They remember the cost. And they make the smaller choice, the safer choice, the choice that keeps the atmosphere stable. And each time that happens, the boundary of what the empath is permitted to be outside of this relationship contracts a little further. The fourth pattern is the most insidious of all, because it does not operate on behavior. It operates on identity. The possessive person, over time, begins a process of quiet reinterpretation of who the empath is. It happens through small, consistent statements that seem like observations but function as definitions. You are too sensitive for most people to understand. You are not like other people, which means most people will not treat you the way you deserve. The world outside this relationship is not equipped to handle who you are. I am the only one who truly sees you. Each statement, taken alone, can sound like love, like someone who genuinely perceives the empath's depth and wants to protect it. But the cumulative effect of these statements is the construction of a specific belief inside the empath. The belief that they are too much for the world, that they require this specific person to navigate reality safely, that their sensitivity is a liability that only this relationship can manage. And once that belief is in place, even partially, the empath's sense of self has been restructured around a narrative that makes leaving feel not just emotionally painful, but genuinely dangerous. Because ownership does not need chains when it has convinced you that you cannot survive without the cage. There is a moment that many empaths describe, though they rarely have language for it when it first arrives. It is not a dramatic moment. It does not come with sudden clarity or a clean emotional break. It comes quietly, usually in an ordinary moment, when the empath is doing something small and unremarkable, and they notice something missing. Not missing from the relationship, missing from themselves. A quality of presence that used to be available to them internally. A sense of existing fully inside their own life rather than perpetually at the edge of someone else's, has quietly disappeared. And in that moment, something shifts. Not yet into action, not yet into decision, but into awareness. And awareness, even when it arrives late, even when it arrives after months or years of a dynamic that has slowly restructured the empath's sense of self around someone else's need, is where everything begins to change. Because you cannot reclaim what you have not first recognized as lost. And the empath who reaches that moment of recognition, however disorienting it feels, has arrived at the only place from which genuine recovery is possible. The first thing that has to be understood in that moment, and it is the thing most empaths resist longest, is that the dynamic they were inside was not a failure of their love. It was not evidence that they loved too much or cared too deeply or gave with too open a hand. Those qualities are not the problem. They never were. What created the vulnerability was not the depth of the empath's capacity, but the absence of a specific understanding about what that capacity is and what it is not. An empath's ability to feel what others feel, to perceive what others carry, to offer a quality of understanding that most people have never had access to before, is not a debt. It is not an obligation that activates automatically in the presence of need. It is not something that belongs to whoever recognizes it first and holds on tightly enough. It is a gift. And gifts, in the truest sense of the word, are chosen. They are given freely, from a place of genuine desire to offer, not extracted through guilt, manufactured crisis, or the slow architectural restructuring of someone's sense of self. The moment an empath fully internalizes that distinction, the moment they understand that their empathy is something they choose to give rather than something others are entitled to take, the entire relational landscape begins to reorganize itself around a different center, around them. But this shift does not happen cleanly, and it is important to say that clearly, because empaths who expect the reclamation of self to feel straightforward often interpret the difficulty of it as evidence that they are not ready or not strong enough or still too attached to leave. The difficulty is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of how thoroughly the dynamic restructured the empath's internal world. When your sense of purpose has been fused with being needed by a specific person, stepping back from that need does not just feel like ending a relationship. It feels like losing a reason to exist. When your identity has been gradually replaced with a version that was constructed to serve someone else's requirement for access. The process of recovering your original self is not simple retrieval. It is reconstruction. It takes time. It takes the kind of patience with yourself that you spent years offering to someone who used it to hold you in place. And it requires something that possessive dynamics are specifically designed to erode. It requires trust in your own perception. Because one of the most consistent effects of being owned over a long period of time is that the empath stops trusting what they feel about their own experience. They have been told, in 100 subtle and unsubtle ways, that their discomfort is an overreaction, that their need for space is selfishness, that their desire for an existence outside the relationship is a form of abandonment. And, after enough repetition, those external interpretations begin to feel like internal truths. Reclaiming yourself begins with understanding that they were never your truths to begin with. The empath who moves through this process does not come out the other side closed. That is the misunderstanding most people carry about what healing from this kind of dynamic looks like. They imagine the empath becoming harder, more guarded, less willing to feel. But that is not what happens when recovery is genuine. What happens is something more precise. The empath does not become less open. They become more selective. And selectivity is not the same as guardedness. Guardedness keeps everything out because it no longer trusts its own ability to discern. Selectivity keeps certain things out because it has developed exactly that ability. It has learned the difference between someone who is drawn to the empath's depth because it resonates with something real in them, and someone who is drawn to it because they need to possess the source. It has learned the difference between intensity that comes from genuine connection and intensity that comes from the fear of losing access. It has learned, perhaps most importantly, the difference between someone who wants to be close to you and someone who needs to own what your closeness gives them. And once that distinction is felt, not just understood intellectually, but felt in the body, in the subtle shift of atmosphere that accompanies each type of person, it becomes very difficult to unknow. Because you have finally developed the one thing the possessive dynamic was always designed to prevent you from having. A self that belongs entirely to you. That is not a small thing. In a world that consistently asks empaths to make themselves available, to extend their understanding endlessly, to treat their emotional depth as a resource that exists for the benefit of whoever needs it most, the decision to treat your own interior world as something of value, something that deserves protection rather than unlimited access, is not withdrawal. It is not coldness. It is not the betrayal of what makes you who you are. It is the fullest possible expression of it. Because your empathy was never meant to be a cage. It was never meant to be the mechanism by which someone else secured permanent access to the most alive parts of you. It was meant to be the way you moved through the world with awareness, with depth, with a quality of presence that enriched every genuine connection you chose to offer to. And the day you stop giving it to people who want to own it and start reserving it for people who know how to honor it is not the day you become less of an empath. It is the day you finally become a free one. Because there is a profound difference between someone who loves you and someone who needs to own you. And the moment you learn to feel that difference before it becomes a pattern is the moment your empathy finally, completely, belongs to you again.